Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this meeting. This is the Development Plans panel meeting. My name is Councillor Caroline Gruen, and I will be chairing the meeting. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the City Council YouTube channel so that the public can observe the meeting without needing to be present. Could I now invite members and officers to introduce themselves? And if we could start from my left, Martin.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Martin Elliott, and I'm the Head of Strategic Planning.
Good afternoon. My name is Councillor Jim McKenna, and I'm an Armley councillor.
Good afternoon, Councillor Kaylee Brooks, Little London and Woodhouse Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Peter Carlill from Carvely and Farsley Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Taylor from Chapel Allerton Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Helen Hayden, Temple Newson Ward and Exec Member for Infrastructure and Climate.
Good afternoon, Anib Sharma, Plans Policy. I'm looking at GBI.
Good afternoon, Catherine Holloway, Team Leader for Local Plans and in Plans Policy.
Good afternoon, Rena Saran, Climate and Energy Officer from the Leeds City Council.
Good afternoon, Heather Davis, Principal Planning Officer in Policy and Plans.
Good afternoon, Nasreen Yunis, Principal Planning Officer.
Hi, Helen Miller from the Policy and Plans team.
Good afternoon, everybody. Councillor Alan Lamb, representing Wetherby Ward.
Good afternoon, Councillor Colin Campbell.
Good afternoon, Councillor Barry Anderson, Adeline Wharfdale Ward.
Good afternoon, Toby Russell, Clerk to the panel.
Afternoon, Nicole Walker, Legal Advisor to the panel.
Good afternoon, David Feeney, Chief Planning Officer.
Good afternoon, Adam Harvack, Group Manager for Policy and Plans.
Thank you very much. So, Toby, could I ask you to address the next 5 agenda items for us, please?
Thank you, Chair. Under agenda item 1, there are no appeals against the refusal of inspection of documents. Under item number 2, there are no items which require the exclusion of the press or the public. Under item number 3, there is no formal late items are noted, but there was supplementary information submitted in relation to item number 7, Local Plan Update 1. And under agenda item number 4, could I ask members to declare any interest they may have? I'd say that's none. And under agenda item number 5, no apologies have been received, but I think we're still waiting for Councillor Finnegan and Akhtar. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So that moves us on now to item 6, please, minutes of the previous meeting, which was on the 12th of July. So if I do as I normally do, which is take them a page at a time and ask for accuracy and matters arising together, please. So item 6, it's page 5 of your pack, the first page of the minutes, page 5. Page 6. Page 7. I don't see anybody indicating, so can I assume that those are considered accurate by those that were attending the meeting? Thank you. So we're on to the main substantive item of the day, which is really a one-item agenda, the Local Plan Update 1 and the publication draft, which I think you've all received. I hope everybody's read every page. There's lots of homework there. Martin, are you going to lead us off?
Thank you, Councillor Gruen. Yes, so just to give a short introduction, because Adam will take you through the detail. Members have seen a lot of this material in various forms before. There was a workshop earlier in the year and another workshop just a few weeks ago where members had the opportunity to look through some of the detailed wording. What you'll find now in your packs is more background material to that wording before we go out to consultation. So members will recall that this local plan update is a specific selective update of the local plan. which has been brought about by the Council's declaration of a climate emergency, and the need to look at what planning can do to look at zero carbon within the city, but also to look at better placemaking, better green infrastructure, look at the flood risk implications of climate change, and also look at the sustainable infrastructure to link in with the Connecting Leeds strategy. So quite a selective but overarching group of topics, which Adam will now take you through.
Thank you, Martin. I'll just take you through the next couple of slides once it catches up. There we go. So yeah, I just wanted to explain the format of today's presentation. So I'm just going to take you through where we are now and what's happened to get us to this point. Also a bit of some details of the material that's in front of you, but just to stress that we're not going to go through the policies line by line in terms of the presentation. Obviously, most of the topic areas will be familiar, well, all of the topic areas will be familiar to members, and hopefully the policies too, but we will alert members to further explanations of revisions since the summer workshops that we've had, latest evidence that's now in place. Also some further changes that will be required following this meeting, but in advance of Executive Board. As noted in the paper as well, as in the main report to it, some further details in the sustainability appraisal. I'll just take you through those. And finally, just a small section on viability before a kind of rounding up of next steps. Sorry, the system's a little bit slow to move forward. There we go. So yeah, where are we now? We obviously, members were involved in a series of workshops over the summer, together with members of the development industry as well, which I think were very helpful in crystallising a lot of thoughts, challenges, but also opportunities for Local Plan Update 1. Following that, we've been able to work up the detailed policy wording and the supporting draft text, which is now in front of you as Appendix 1. We also have the supporting legal documentation, including the sustainability appraisal, which has been drafted, which is in front of you in Appendix 2, in addition to other documents as well, which I'll take you through slightly later. And so the position we are in now is obviously to present this material to you and to seek the endorsement of Development Plans Panel before Executive Board approve this material for consultation. So what's in front of you? And Martin has helpfully clarified there that the effect of these policies and supplementary text is an amendment to the core strategy, and members who've been on Development Plans Panel for some time will be kind of aware of that process, having been through the core strategy selective review. In regulatory terms, this will work similarly in that it is amendments to that document. From a legal point of view, the development plan document of Local Plan Update 1 is standalone, and Nicole will interrupt if I'm wrong on that, but as a standalone document, what it does is in effect amend the core strategy. So that's kind of the headline of what is happening, and in front of you, as I say, Appendix 1, we've got the draft policies and supporting text, the sustainability appraisal, Appendix 2, the habitat regulations screening assessment, and just go through. That's a requirement of regulations to demonstrate the impact of the policies and proposals on protected sites, particularly of European significance, of which there are two key ones just within the border and one just outside the border of Leeds, which we have to take account of. And I'll just go back again, just to reiterate the purpose of sustainability appraisal, which again, many members will be well aware of, but the purpose of essentially recording and testing the sustainability of both options, but the policies themselves. And it's an absolutely integral part of the process of plan making and a legal requirement as well. We've also got the report of scoping consultation in the pack, which again is just a summary of some of the points that were raised as part of the original consultation. And again, is a legal requirement in terms of both consultation but also submission when we get to that point. And finally, in your packs, we've got a duty to cooperate summary document, which will form part of the agenda for a meeting that's taking place tomorrow with partner authorities and agencies as part of the duty cooperate, which again is a legal test of plan making. So I just want to take through some of the changes that have taken place since the summer workshops, just to highlight some of the points that I think are of most importance and go to the heart of some of the policies. The first one is in EN1 Part 2, and this is about operational carbon. Previously, I think in the policy, when we took it as a workshop draft, the wording essentially gave the effect that it applied to all development. We wanted to caveat that. So the version that you've got in front of you now makes clear that there will be some clear caveats where that isn't appropriate. So an example might be a change of use application, where it's very difficult for, let's say, a small shop changing to another use. They're not changing any of the fabric of the building. It's going to be very, very difficult, nigh impossible for that building to be made zero carbon as part of that process. So we just wanted to clarify that examples such as that will be not expected to meet the policy. It would be seen as unreasonable to require that kind of development to be required to be zero carbon, but obviously would welcome members' views on that point. Also, we try to, through the policy, introduce quite ambitious, but what we believe are realistic targets for what's called energy use intensity and space heating demand. And what the purpose there is to ensure that the real focus, or at least the first focus, is to make sure that buildings are as energy efficient as they possibly can be. I'm sure we're all aware of the cost inflation with things like energy and heating costs. That's why it's particularly important why efforts are made by developers as part and architects as part of new developments to ensure that first and foremost reducing the amount of energy that's required by a new building is the most important step. And one of the reasons for that is because we were aware of a potential loophole, probably going to go as far as that, but potential loophole that in theory any development could be made zero carbon if you either built enough solar panels or you offset it with a big enough payment, and that wasn't the purpose of the policy, to allow for that kind of loophole. It may be that through detailed consideration they're the avenues that a development will have to go through, but in the first instance we really wanted that focus on setting really good standards for energy use and space heating demand. The second element is about sustainable construction standards, and this flows from, I think, some concerns that were raised by members at the workshop, that there was a danger that some of the options that were raised in that policy weren't, and you'll recall that there was different standards. So there was, say, a passive house standards, there was a REBA 2030 standard, all a series of different standards that developers could choose to meet as part of their developments. But I think the danger, which was pointed out by a few members, was that these don't necessarily compare very well against each other, and it's not clear what standard one meets and what standard another meets, and whether they are actually comparable. I think the conclusion was that they're not particularly well comparable. And I think another danger that members foresaw was that, well, won't it be won't be a case that for some developers may choose to take the easiest of those options rather than the one that we really would like them to do. So we've reflected on that and felt that the two standards of Home Quality Mark 4 for residential and BREEAM Outstanding for non-residential would be the most appropriate standards to set for sustainable construction standards. Members will recall that we already have BREEAM Excellent for non-residential at the moment in the core strategy, but we don't have anything for residential. And it's felt that Home Quality Mark 4 sets a high standard, but an achievable standard, which is important to set out. So that's something that members may wish to reflect on as well. The next section was about renewable energy mapping, which was explained previously, and has obviously been a kind of a long-running part of this local plan update in terms of having detail on opportunity areas for particular solar and wind. but it was felt that at the time that we had previous meetings, we hadn't got the results of that work back. We now have, and the ACOM study goes into that renewable energy mapping, and that's included in your packs as the new policies for particular solar and wind. So it includes constraints such as flood risk, heritage, landscape character, green and blue infrastructure, and future development, amongst many others. And I think it's important to stress as well that by identifying an area of land within an opportunity area, that doesn't mean that it automatically gets supported at the planning application stage. There are an awful lot of caveats within the policy, including probably the most important, the requirement to meet Greenbelt policy and meeting very special circumstances. So it's not a green light necessarily for renewable energy in those locations, but it is a positive step forward to say where the council considers there could be potential in those locations that could be explored further through the policies. So we've got this map for you here, which again is in your packs, and that's the opportunity areas for solar. I think, and this is perhaps me thinking out loud, but I think probably for the consultation draft, it may be better for us to flip the colours round a little bit, just to show showing where the positive is in terms of, at the moment, where we're saying is the opportunity area is the white area. It may be better for the consultation just be clearer by showing that as a different colour rather than having it as white. But as you can see, for solar, quite large expanses of the city are potentially suitable for solar farms. For wind, it's a much smaller area, but still significant. I thought it was important just so that members had the opportunity to focus on these particular elements because they hadn't seen them before. On flood risk, obviously members have got lots of new and amended policies in front of them, but I particularly wanted to highlight policy Water 4, which has been revised to incorporate essentially climate change scenarios, which has come out of the work as part of the strategic flood risk assessment work, which has been done in partnership with ACOM. And the purpose of that policy is to make sure that future flood risk is being accounted for, not just today's flood risk. So the following slides is an example from a part of the city about what present day flood risk may look like and what a future climate change scenario would look like, which is increasing river flows by 50% compared to the current day. It's, as you'll see, it's not a dramatic change. There are small parcels of land that are affected in a future scenario that aren't affected right now. But it is an important change because it does show that the areas that previously might not have to consider this should be considering it in future. It's also worth stressing as well that this is still in draft in terms of this material, as the Environment Agency are reviewing the data and the report. I should stress that's the SFRA is still in draft because the Environment Agency are reviewing it. So if I just show us the next area line. So this is an area of the city that many will be familiar with, and it's taken relatively at random, but it's for Mabgate. And this is present day flood risk as a result of the updated SFRA. And that's the future scenario. So as you can see, that if we played a game of Spot the Difference, it'd be quite difficult to do that. But if I keep sort of going backwards and forwards, you can see particularly in the center of the map, there are areas that do change. And so that's the kind of implications we're talking about by this policy, is that those areas that in the previous, as in present day situation, wouldn't need to address some of the elements of that through their flood risk assessments. What we're saying is that through application of a sequential test and potentially an exceptions test, they would need to consider that as an issue. So I just wanted to highlight that as an example of the kinds of effects that policy will have. The next section was just to alert members to a change from sort of previous versions about a removal of a policy that was previously, I think, titled additional planting. And I think on reflection, it was felt that many other policies, both existing but particularly new policies, are providing for additional planting. We've listed those on the table, on the slide there. And I think of particular note, we've got policy F1, which requires tree planting as part of private gardens, including fruit trees. We've got policy P10 6, which again is requiring additional planting, hedges, street trees. Biodiversity net gain, G9, is likely to have increases in things of certainly planting, not necessarily tree planting. It will depend on the site specifics, but also the quality of new green spaces, which is G4B. Again, is setting out that it must include new tree planting unless justified otherwise. So our feeling is that there is sufficient coverage for the requirement of additional planting without the need for a bespoke policy that sets that out, but obviously would welcome members' views on that point too. Now I'm going to just hand over to Catherine Holloway. Who's just going to take us through the 20-minute neighbourhoods work, which again members are well familiar with, but we've got finalised evidence from Mark McDonald's who've been doing that work. And whilst Catherine Holloway is just circulating a revised policy, which she'll come on to as part of her presentation, but it's a slight amendment to the policy that you've got in front of you, which we wanted to ensure that members have got a copy of. As I say, Catherine will take you through the purpose of that as part of her section of this presentation. So I will just hand over to you, Catherine, and just let me know when you want me to move a slide.
Thanks, Adam. So yeah, I've just circulated an amendment to Appendix 1, Policy SP1A, and that's the new policy on achieving 20-minute neighbourhoods in Leeds. There's been a lot of work since we last presented the map that's on the screen that Mott McDonald's prepared back in 2020. Subsequently to that presentation that they've given to the council, we commissioned Mott McDonald's to further that work because there are a number of assumptions that we were questioning about how they were mapping the accessibility to come out with that heap map. So we commissioned them and they started working in May this year, and we've had that work back, and it's useful just to run through, I think, the methodology of what they've been looking at to understand how we've looked to tighten up the messaging between the explanatory text and the policy, clearly defining how we're going to test the accessibility to 10-minute walking distances for windfall applications. So next slide, please. Probably can't read that. But Mott McDonald's, they've created an analytical approach looking at walkable access to a range of services and core amenities that are considered essential for sustainable and local neighbourhoods. And such amenities include local shops, early years education, doctors, green spaces, playgrounds, and public transport stops. In reviewing the work undertaken back in 2020, we've been able to tailor this analysis to reflect the importance of different amenities and services across Leeds and the different communities, defining new amenities, services and facilities to the list that we want to be included, and specify the weightings to those that we consider more important or essential services and facilities. So it's very much tailored to Leeds. The standard selection of core amenities, which is in the circle diagram on the screen, was discussed within an internal officer workshop earlier this year, and that involved colleagues across policy and plans, highways, regeneration, communities and localities, and economic services, where we considered the definition of what an amenity and facility was and whether anything should be added, the importance of each amenity, and gave it a scale of 0 to 5. And then the willingness, or the consideration of the willingness for people to travel to such an amenity, either within a 20-minute neighbourhood or beyond. So internally, we had an agreed officer list of amenities. However, we wanted this to be verified by local community groups. So what we did was an online smart survey inviting feedback from the community group network on what they considered important and willingness to travel to amenities under the consideration. So we provided this long list of services and amenities and asked them to rank or select what they considered to be essential and those that were desirable. So it's slightly simplified the sort of categorization and weighting. Through that survey, we received 730 complete responses, and comparing the responses to understand how closely community aligned to our weightings, the results demonstrated a really close alignment. So those amenities that we'd already categorized as sort of high weightings, those are important, were also agreed by community groups. So we had the confidence that the weighting that we're applying was right. MOTS then apply an analytical approach using GIS mapping to plot the locations of each of those amenities listed and define a 10-minute walking isochrone from each location. That's based on a set of parameters outlining average walking speeds, networks, and public rights of way. The district is then divided into regular hexagonal cells for the number of overlapping isochrones within, the number of overlapping isochrones within each cell is counted, and the weightings for each of the amenities are then applied and added together to provide a weighted accessibility score for each cell. And for the purposes of the calculations, weightings were assigned on a scale of 0 to 1. Next slide, please. So there you can see how we've applied the categories of services and amenities into those weighting brackets, where where they're 5, they're considered the most important, and for the weighting, they get a point of 1. Quite complicated. I'm not going to go into the detail. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the outputs can be presented in a series of what's called a hex map, and on screen is a static map of the accessibility. But we've also got the associated GSA output files, which includes the information on the weighted score of each cell and the amenities detected in the isochrone analysis. And that can enable us more detailed interrogation of the output layer and other interested parties should they wish following the conclusion of the study. So based on the assigned weightings, the total achievable score for any hex on the map is 18, and the outputs are presented by their total weighting scores. Hexes shaded darker red in this map are those with the higher overall accessibility scores, meaning that a greater range of services are accessible within a 20-minute return trip on foot. The scale graduates through orange and yellow shades for lower accessibility scores through to dark blue for areas with the least number of accessible amenities. Based on the scale of 0 to 18 emerging from the accessibility analysis, simple classifications have also been defined, and that's been put into the policy explanation. And that enables us to divide the scores into quarters. Next slide, please. So that we've got 4 categories. We've got walkable neighbourhoods, which score between 13.5 and 18, or 75 to 100%. And this is a neighbourhood with a majority of essential and desirable facilities within walking distance. We then go down to good accessibility, which scores between 9 and 13.49, or 50 to 75%, which has got many essential and desirable facilities within walking distance, but some journeys require a longer trip. We've then got limited accessibility, which scores between 4.5 and 8.99, or 25 to 50%, where some essential or desirable facilities are within walking distance, but most journeys will require a longer trip. And then lastly, we've got the poor accessibility of 0 to 25%, where a very limited number of essential and desirable facilities are within walking distance. We've taken those classifications and provided these in both the explanatory text of the policy as an approach to enable us to score windfall applications. It also has monitoring capabilities for both SA scoring and monitoring indicators along the lines of number of or percentage of properties within walkable neighbourhoods and/or good accessibility. Further interrogation of the work is still taking place, but initial analysis of the 4 classification areas has looked at whether there are any common services or missing amenities that separate those neighbourhoods. For example, primary schools with a weighting of 5, i.e. it's important, can be found in 95% of walkable neighbourhoods, 80% in good accessibility areas, 49% in limited accessibility areas, and 17% of poor accessibility areas. Analysing these changes within these percentages for services and facilities across the classifications can help us to identify where key amenities are commonly lacking from one classification to the next. The biggest differences between walkable neighbourhoods and good amenity accessible neighbourhoods were observed in the reduction in GP practices, pharmacies, libraries and nursery schools. And at the other end, the biggest differences between limited and poor accessibility neighbourhoods were in postboxes, parks, playgrounds and restaurants. The analysis shows where amenity provision could be changed in order to provide more amenity accessible neighbourhoods, either by providing better walking access to certain amenities or by improving the provision of missing amenities themselves. And this can help in terms of determining Part 3B of Policy SP1A. Lastly, the importance of having this as GIS maps and not a static map means that the information can be interrogated and updated, recognising that amenities maps will change over time. It also has huge benefits in administration for other council departments in the partnership work that's required to really make 20-minute neighbourhoods work. Hopefully that explains the circulation, the policy changes that the addendum circulated, particularly at criteria 2.2 and 3B. I'll stop there. Thank you. Just a question.
I think Catherine's covered these elements, but just to say, I think some shifting around has been required in terms of policies EN9, which I think previously was listed within a separate section. This is the drive-through development policy we've now brought through to EN9, because I think the real focus there is on air quality, and that flows a lot better. We just wanted to as well clarify some wording points in P10 in terms of definitions of things like permanent and physical have been added. We've also added, as you can see in the draft in front of you, avoiding areas of high flood risk, just to ensure that, thank you David, just to ensure that that's properly considered as part of the 20-minute neighbourhoods assessment, and the changes above, I think Catherine has already alluded to. So I just wanted to go through some small changes that have taken place or will be required to take place before Executive Board. And as my introduction, I hope made clear, as with the core strategy selective review, we're going to need to introduce some introductory text to the core strategy just to explain how this development plan document changes the core strategy. That isn't in your packs at the moment, but it will read very similar to the existing core strategy does, which already incorporates the core strategy selective review, but we'll just make clear how the local plan update 1 is amending the core strategy. So that's just some clarification word in there. Also on that point, I think slightly erroneously we refer to the plan period within the sort of explanatory text to policy SP0 as being 2024 to 2040. That's in error. It should be 2022 to 2040. So we'll make that change before we should members endorse the documentation for Executive Board. The final change is to alert members to, in terms of the policy as well, we need to ensure consistency of language in the schedule of deleted policies. Occasionally we'll refer to deletion, sometimes we'll refer to superseded. We just need to make sure that that's fully up to date and accurate. Okay, so that's kind of policy changes. I just wanted to take you through some elements of the sustainability appraisal that have been amended to since the reports were publicised, and this is alluded to in the report, but there are some minor changes. It's just be worth taking members through there. So there's a fuller explanation of unreasonable alternatives, and just as an example of that, an unreasonable alternative might be something that the planning system has no control over. So whilst it might be a very useful thing to do in terms of climate change, I'll pick an extreme example. Someone might say, well, ban all cars. That's not necessarily something that the planning system can deal with. So that would be an example of an unreasonable alternative. And the point there is that it is for the SA process to determine reasonable and unreasonable alternatives so that we can understand what our best options are, what are the most sustainable options, and that informs which policies we arrive at. So and further to that point, we're just going to clarify as well how reasonable alternatives have been assessed in the main report. Again, as said in the report, we just needed to finalise the scoring of the flood risk, demonstrating that the options selected, which do demonstrate the options selected, are still, a more sustainable approach than do nothing. So there's nothing in the changes which change the direction that we're taking. It's just a clarification of some of those points. Similarly, mitigation, we just wanted to provide additional detail on some of the negative effects of the policies, and it really is worth stressing that there aren't that many negative effects of the policies, but inevitably there will be some, which is what the essay process records, and we wanted to expand a little bit further on how that will be mitigated. Some minor scoring changes as well, and commentary, but again, just stressing that that has no overall impact on the option that's selected. Again, in Appendix 10, you'll see at the moment the version in your report's fairly, perhaps a little bit too light in terms of monitoring framework. That's been finalised in terms of further detail. I think it's worth noting a bit of a challenge that we have there in terms of monitoring frameworks, in terms of how you monitor quality policies, particularly things like design and green space policies, which we've got in the plan. That is a challenge that we're still grappling with, and hopefully through the consultation it may be that we receive further details on how best that might be addressed, because at the moment it is quite difficult to record in a kind of metric how you've achieved a quality policy. So if members have any further thoughts on that, very much welcome them. And then again, erroneously in your report pack, it refers to there being a non-technical summary. The more eagle-eyed amongst you will notice that there isn't a non-technical summary in the reports pack, and I apologise for that. That will be included in the executive board agenda, but just to stress, there's nothing in the non-technical summary that's reaches any different conclusions from the full report of the sustainability appraisal. As it suggests, it is just a summary. So there's no difference in terms of scoring or anything like that. And just a final point on viability, just because it is a really important part of this plan. I think an aspect of the plan that we anticipate to receive perhaps quite a lot of scrutiny, perhaps quite a lot of objection, is its viability, and we've commissioned, as I think we've updated members previously, work from Addison Young in terms of the strategic viability of the plan, and that work has now been finalised and shows that the suite of policies is strategically viable. But I think it is worth just pointing out as well that there are a small number of development scenarios which do show sort of pressures on viability. I think it's important to note as well that isn't the test of strategic viability, whether in every single scenario, in every single type of development, in every single location, that it has to be demonstrated to be viable. It's inevitable with any plan that you will get elements that may have viability pressures. The point is that across a strategic level, across the suite, is it broadly viable? And we're confident that the evidence that we have demonstrates that point. But again, happy to take any questions on that element. And so I just wanted to go through the next steps before wrapping up, and inviting comments and questions from members. So subject obviously to your endorsement, the next step would be to go to executive board on the 21st of December. For a consultation in mid-October. We're currently sort of working up the engagement or consultation strategy at the moment, and obviously that will be finalised in the coming weeks. And then we'll hopefully go out to consultation for 8 weeks from October. Oh no, I don't mean December. Sorry, yeah, that should say September. Yeah, so apologies on the. Apologies for that. Yes, that should be the 21st of September. There's always one that gets through, isn't there? So sorry for that. Yes, don't cancel your Christmas plans for that one. So 21st of September, and then consultation to begin mid-October, with, as I said, finalising the consultation strategy. And as with every consultation that we do, we would obviously review and analyse the comments that we receive before, hopefully progressing to a submission of this plan in 2023. So yeah, just like to open up to questions and comments, but also like to take the opportunity to thank both members and colleagues at the other end of the table, but also in the department for a lot of hard work to bring these policies together. Thank you to them for their hard work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Adam. Can we also thank colleagues at the far end of the table for the work they've put in on these policies? They are incredibly detailed, and the amount of research and calculation and so on that you put into those is really amazing, first class. So thank you very much for that. And I do think today's presentation, Adam, has been absolutely superb. Thank you. It's been really well sequenced and easy to understand and well presented. So that's given us a good basis for our discussion today. Thank you. And I would like to invite both questions and comments at this point, because it is a discussion. I just saw Colin first and then Alan. Thank you. Councillor Campbell.
Can I echo your comments in relation to the detail? I'm sure, as you said, we've all read it through. Some of us might be able to say it was so good we read it twice, but I don't think there'll be many of us. And I think actually it's a really, from my point of view, it's a really good document, because I think we're about to do something fairly radical. And for that, I'm happy. But as you know, there's no way we're going to get through this without me asking a question. Can I start off with Catherine's latest version of SP 1A, and I'm looking at 3C. Can you just define that for us? Because there are one or two of us who live in the north of the city who might actually say most of north of the city effectively falls into this category now, particularly as first seen to be knocking off another bus service.
Yeah, this is a criteria that's currently in our existing core strategy under policy H2. So this is our existing windfall for housing policy. And it allows the consideration for highways colleagues, for children's services, and for colleagues in health to consider the capacity of the infrastructure, the physical built infrastructure, the buses, the schools, the GPs. It is not asking us, the difficulty that we've done in the MOTS work is we've assessed accessibility to services and facilities. That does not take into consideration the quality of those services that people are accessing. So there's no detail on whether those GP services are full. That's where we rely on the joined upworking and consultations with colleagues in health services, children's services and highways to feed into that work. And this is just a criteria that allows us to consider those factors.
I'm just thinking, Chair, that given that this is a fairly nebulous concept with the best will in the world, and I understand what we're trying to do. Is there some way we could perhaps firm it up slightly to actually give, I think particularly members of the public, some sort of understanding as to what you might regard as capacity in transport, etc. Because, as you know, people often come to us and say you shouldn't allow this development to take place because there's no doctor's surgery, there's no spaces in the primary schools, etc. And if we have a line in, it assumes that we will take that into account. So I think I think it would be useful for members of the public to understand what those criteria will be for us. I'm not asking you to tell me now, but I think that might be a useful one. All right.
That's a really useful point. I'm sure you didn't use the word nebulous in a critical sense. You were describing how the phrase comes across, and but yeah, I think that would be helpful, and I can see colleagues at the other end nodding. Is that something either of you would want to comment on?
No, I think that's absolutely fine. I think the first protocol, Councillor Campbell, will be to probably go through the core strategy to see how it's currently referred to, and to kind of use some of that wording, which is obviously already passed examination. But if we feel that that's not quite scratching the itch, so to speak, we can obviously draft something additional. But no, I think that's a fair suggestion. Happy to take that on board.
Did you have any further points? Yes, you did.
A couple of extra ones. Fortunately, as you say, the presentation was very good, so a couple of these have actually already been answered. If I look on page 13, I think we've all expressed concerns about green infrastructure in particular. Page 13 on the first bit, not the appendices. On the agenda, not the appendices. All right. I think I'm concerned. I've just lost my thread there. Sorry. I think we really do need to emphasise the fact that if you're providing green space, we should be providing it on site. And it is only as a very, very last resort we accept, one, off-site, and two, buying out of the responsibility. Because I think we've all seen occasions where developers, the default position is to buy out of your requirements under green space, because it shifts the responsibility, maximises your profits. And so I think we need to ensure the wording ensures that that's a very clear priority. Can we just turn to page 14? We talk about new policy G2B, ancient woodland, long established woodland, ancient trees and veteran trees. I think it will be useful to define what a long established woodland is, because we often get, again, at plans panels, members of the public coming along and saying to us, this is an ancient woodland. We've all heard it, and actually, if you go along and look at it, the trees may be 50 years old. So I know for some of us that's ancient. Yeah, well, it's as old as us. Old as us, so it may well be ancient. But I think that will be a useful definition. I also am slightly concerned because there isn't, and I think there has to be a role for new, and in particular self-seeded woodlands, and there appears to be no protection for them at all. Now, some time ago there was a planning application in Otley, and we got a tree preservation order on some self-seeded woodland, which was only about 20 years old. And when we were talking about it, one of the reasons for the TPO was because actually there's very little of this type of woodland in the Leeds metropolitan district, mainly because it gets cleared. But it's a particular type of habitat that I think if we can find a form of words, perhaps could be included within this definition. So I asked that question, and a subject dear, I think, to all our hearts is viability. And it's mentioned on page 16, but there's quite a big bit there. I think from my point of view, I would like us to feel confident that we can resist the pressures from developers who come along to us and bring the district value along and say, we can't afford to do this. We can't afford to meet your minimum standards. So therefore, let us build a substandard development. And at the moment, we don't seem to have much in the way of control over that, because if the district valuer says to us, for viability reasons, they can't afford to do the affordables. For viability reasons, they can't afford to do the green space. We're building substandard developments, in my opinion. And I need some confidence that we will be able to resist that. And we will have the ability to say to developers, look, what you're proposing to do on this site is not viable. Go away and come back with something that actually is and meets what are, after all, minimum standards. And I just, sorry to, a couple more points when we got into the slightly thicker document. On page 12, it mentions reducing the need, the SP, is that SP0 or SPO? SP0, number 9 says reduce the need to travel by car and encourage sustainable transport in accord with policy. Again, you've raised it as well as I have, Chair, and as well as many of us have, in that we cannot effectively allow developments to take place that don't have facilities for cars if we haven't got in place a public transport network that allows you to exist without a car. And I'll put my bid in at this point, because I say it on a regular basis on city plans, particularly in the city centre, where developers use this principle that there's a good public transport network, so we don't have to provide car parking spaces. They are in effect being subsidised by the council, in that we're allowing them not to provide that space, but in the outer areas we would require you to provide a parking space. Now that parking space takes up developable land and therefore reduces to some extent the profits that a developer can make. Within the city centre we don't ask that, so therefore the developer gets a subsidy. And I think, again, I have some concerns that this could be interpreted as simply saying you don't have to provide any car parking spaces, without at least attempting to find some source of funding for a more comprehensive transport network. And finally, page 57, G4A, I can't know. 5524, green space will be sought for developments of 10 or more dwellings. Why 10? If there are only 9 dwellings, why can't they have green space? Okay, proportionally, but why not? And I think I'll use the example that really irritates me about, again, a local planning application, in that a developer comes along and says to us, actually, I want to develop all this site, and I'm going to split it in 2. One has 5 units on, one has 4 units on, or one has 6 units on, one has 4 units on. So actually, it's only 4. I don't need to do this. So use the system against us. It seems to me that if we believe green space is important, everybody ought to provide it. And certainly all developments ought to have something in that line. And with that, Chair, you'd be pleased to know I'll stop talking.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to ask officers to take the points that you've made, Councillor Campbell, and make a point about how viable each of those are. Would you like to do that, Adam? Or Martin wants to do something first.
I'm happy to do the green space.
Okay.
One's Councillor Gruen. So Councillor Campbell, just come back to me if I've missed any of these. Just in terms of the green space on site, policy G4A, which is page 57 of the document, which is the one that you took us to last, actually. That policy does say And that's an existing policy unchanged by the local plan update at this stage, that residential developments of 10 dwellings or more, come back to that, will be required to provide on-site green space. So there is a preference for on-site there within the policy, but then it goes on to say, in determining whether that should be on-site or off-site, there's a series of factors that can influence that in terms of looking at the wider deficits in terms of quality and quantity of green space within the area, as well as the feasibility of that site actually delivering that green space. Secondly, in terms of the definitions, there will be a glossary update that's required. So we will make sure that any terms that we're using are covered off in a glossary. That's okay. And some of those glossary definitions are actually in the NPPF as well. On the self-seeding woodland point, I think what I would say to that is we'd ensure that self-seeded woodland had protection and consideration through the development process as part of green infrastructure, because what the new green infrastructure policies seek to do is look to developers to assess the site in terms of its green infrastructure merits before they go on, which is something very different to the way it is now. So that would cover something like a self-seeded woodland. The tree policies are very much around the sort of the amenity value, the carbon sequestration value of trees that we have in the city. So whether it would be appropriate to put the self-seeded woodland section within that tree policy, we'll take that away and have a think about it. But certainly the GI policy, the green infrastructure policy, would cover that. And on the 10 dwelling, in terms of triggering on-site green space, that's what the existing core strategy says. So the policy, we weren't seeking to change that, and the 10 dwellings is the threshold between a minor development and a major development. That's at the threshold at which lots of things like affordable housing contributions and other contributions kick in, because it's felt that at that scale of development, the development can accommodate those additional benefits. But I understand what you're saying about green space. What our design policies and what our placemaking policies designed to cover development below 10 units as well will do is seek to ensure that opportunities for better layouts and better recreation amongst the units can be achieved. But I think a requirement for formal layout of green space at below 10 dwellings is probably too onerous within the plan at this stage. I don't have the evidence
Quick
for that.
response to that. I understand what you're saying to me, and partly I can agree, but there is no reason why we shouldn't require an off-site green space contribution for 10 or fewer dwellings, proportional, of course, because if you can't provide it on site, it may be difficult with a 10 unit development, but certainly green space within the wider area for the people who are involved is important. So could we perhaps think about a levy?
Can I come in at this point?
Yes.
I hear exactly what you're saying about that. And I just wonder if the wording couldn't be made instead of saying 10 dwellings is the cutoff point and at that point you don't need to. Could we not have a slightly more positive framed sentence which actually says, we do expect you to do whatever you possibly can in more definitive terms than that, rather than say there's no need to even try. I just wonder if we couldn't manage something around that.
I think the point's well made, Chair, and thanks to Councillor Campbell as well for that. We'll take that away, if that's okay, and we'll have a look at what we can do to strengthen that up and encourage the developments of 10 dwellings or fewer to provide some green space.
Do you want to come on the other?
That's okay. Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think as well, as Martin said, we'll obviously take that away, but I think we do need to factor in the viability implications of that, which would be different, obviously, for smaller developments. So we may need to think about how that gets recalculated if there is a cost attached to them. On that viability point, I'll bring in Nazreen, because obviously you made viability points, Councillor Campbell.
Yeah, in terms of Councillor Campbell's concerns about developers submitting viability appraisals, I think more than they should do on these sites. The viability work that we've just undertaken, carried out by Avis and Young, shows quite strongly that at a strategic level, the policies existing and new are viable. Despite that, I think developers can sometimes come back with individual viability appraisals. And I think what we need to do really is go back to national planning guidance, which again quite clearly shows, has indicated that local authorities should take at a higher level, should take quite at a strategic level the work that we do. We should have quite a lot of confidence in that, and the onus is very clearly on developers to demonstrate when there is a departure from the strategic work. And I guess that comes down again to us as a local planning authority being quite cautious with developers in saying that actually our work is quite strong. You know, it's got a strong strategic viability basis. We have every confidence that these policies can be demonstrated. If there is a difference and a developer is submitting a viability appraisal, we need to be stronger as a local planning authority in saying that we won't accept that in some instances.
Well, I think with the best will in the world, two points. One of yours about the 10 units or fewer. Actually, my experience tells me that it's sites with 500 or 600 units on where they claim it's not viable. The smaller ones aren't an issue, and I think it's part of that. Okay, if you're not doing it on site, if you're making a contribution into the pot, for want of a better word, proportionally for your number of units, that's on these developments, it's not really an issue. I'm slightly disappointed with the comments, though I'm not surprised in that national policy does seem to be the loophole that developers use to avoid meeting all the commitments that we ask for now. And we're in the process of asking for what developers will describe as more onerous requirements to meet what we're describing as our minimum standards. And so I can foresee that we're going to get a lot more with developers coming along to us. I'm basically saying we can't provide any of the things that you want us to do, like affordable housing, like green space, etc. If we want this development to make us the 20% profit that we're expecting. And it seems to me that in some ways, if what you're saying is true, what we're saying in relation to viability is slightly wishful thinking. And I would prefer us to see if we can create a form of words which is more robust and simply makes it clear to developers that we wish them to meet our minimum standards. And if they can't do that, then the site itself is not viable.
I mean, the work demonstrates quite clearly that the policies at a cumulative level, at a strategic level, are viable. We're in a very strong position as a local planning authority.
I think the problem with viability, though, is that we have to believe what the developer says at a certain level, and then the district valuer or whoever's looking at it can do as much work as they like, knowing what equations to use. You have to believe what they tell you. They've paid for it and so on. And I was talking to a district valuator informally recently, and that was his concern, that he felt, you know, he had to believe what they said with no choice. They didn't have to show him the receipt. You know, we have to take what they say and then all of a sudden they can make adjustments, and you wonder how they've made them. And I think unless the system is somehow changed at that level, we're always going to struggle with it. I don't know where to go from there. Yeah, David.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's a key issue, Councillor Campbell, you've raised about viability. And, you know, we've had this before, haven't we, at plan making exercises, the core strategy and the site allocation plan. I think it's something we need to really flush out of the examination process so that we get a very clear and emphatic position from the inspector in the report, if that's going to be possible. Because I think, as Nazreen is saying, the work that's been done demonstrates that there is viability at that strategic level. Where we have the challenge is that developers come in, don't they, and they say, well, actually, with our site, there are some abnormals which doesn't appear on the radar at that strategic level, and this is what's tipping it over the edge. But something's going to have to change, isn't it? If a climate emergency has been declared nationally as well as locally, what's going to change to make these policies work? So I think in terms of how this is presented through the examination process, I think we need a very clear and emphatic position from the inspector drawn out of our evidence, and we think the evidence stands up, and I would hope that would be sufficient to persuade the inspector to put it in no uncertain terms when they come back. The challenge, though, even with that, is that it is relative, isn't it? I mean, at the moment, the retail price index is going up, and we're told that the cost of materials is going up as well. So it's always subject to change. And I think if there's variance from the strategic position to those local positions, it's flushing out what those differences are and whether they actually stand up as evidence in their own right. So I think, Chair, our approach really through the examination will be to flush this out so that we are as robust as we can be in then applying these policies on a day-to-day basis through the development management process. Thank you.
I think we're going to have to move on, if that's all right, Councillor Campbell. But I just want to say one point about your initial point that you made on green space, about encouraging at all levels, or insisting even, that the green space is on site. Absolutely see the value in that. But I think there are exceptions to that personally. For example, if you get a development which is in every way good and better, except it's slightly short on green space, are you really going to say don't do it at all? Or put a bit in the central pot? And the other side of it is that I'm in a ward which is surrounded by wards that have got lots of space for developments. And the ward I represent has virtually no space for development at all. So we never get any green space infrastructure invested in our ward, in our parks and in our green spaces, like the surrounding wards do. And they have much better facilities as a result of developments putting green space elsewhere. It's just a counterpoint. I agree in essence with what you said.
I don't disagree with what you said, Chair, and it's not really the position for a long debate on this. But I think I recognise that the ward that you represent has perhaps a greater deficit in green space than some of the other wards in the city. And so actually it would be useful to get some new green space in there. And what worries me about the penchant developers have for buying out is that they simply make a contribution into Parks and Countryside's pot, which goes to maintain a park for another 3 or 4 years, but we don't get any more. And I think it's that principle that we should be aiming to get more, particularly in areas similar to the one you represent. And that's really why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Thanks very much for that. And we can go now to Councillor Lamb.
Thank you, Chair. I've got 3 points, and if you don't mind, if I can ask each one and then get an answer, I think it'll be easier because they're different. So I'm coming back to viability quickly. So I think I take the points that have been made. That I don't think the issue is with the strategic part of viability, because there's an evidence base for it, and equally there's an opportunity for developers to test that through the process with the inspector. The issue is with the practicality of delivering. And there was an application recently, I can't remember the specifics, where we had the district valuer, and where it all unravelled was they only had to tell us that the scheme they were putting before us wasn't viable. What they couldn't tell us was that other things couldn't be viable on the site. That's the issue, that they're not required to say, well, we can't do, that's not viable. And their argument is, therefore, you have to give us permission. They don't have to say, but you could do A, B, and C, and that would be viable, and that would meet the policy tests. And I don't know if there's a way we can capture that as a requirement in here, because that would solve the problem. It's going to be tested whether this is viable as a strategic document. It's the practical point.
I'll make a start, and Nasri may want to come in. But I think the difficulty with that is that to be able to do that, we'd essentially need to do a site-by-site viability assessment as part of this plan to prove that sites were viable. Because otherwise, the evidence that we've got in front of us is the strategic viability assessment, which is what's required as part of plan making. But when it comes down to individual application processes, it's always going to be a case of a site-by-site assessment, which we won't have done at this stage of plan making. So it's quite difficult for this plan to be able to show that individual sites are viable, and it's not going to be possible for local plans to change national policy, which is probably a more fundamental issue.
Perhaps I didn't explain myself very well, because that's not the point I was making. It's the site allocations plan has determined whether a site is viable for development and set out the site requirements and what's deliverable. The issue is when a specific planning application comes forward, if the developer says it's not viable, they only have to get the district valuer to say if the scheme they are proposing is viable. They do not have to say whether or not it's viable to develop the site. That's the point I'm making. And we're put in a position where, because the district valuer has said this scheme is not viable to deliver those things, therefore you need to approve it. I'd like us to be in a position where we say, well, your scheme isn't, but another scheme may very well be. So go away and bring us that one.
Martin.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. I understand what you're saying, but the local planning authority has to assess the planning application that's in front of it at any point in time, and as part of that assessment, can look at the viability of that scheme. As far as I'm aware, there's nothing in the regulations or in the guidance that would suggest or allow for a plan B or a plan C, but through looking at that viability assessment, the council, with its viability assessor in terms of the district valuer, can look at where those viability pressures are. So they can look at whether it's around the affordable housing burden, for example, or whether it's around the layout of the development, but could be around density. And I think that the council would be perfectly within its rights to say, what would a higher density within this scheme look like in terms of viability, and actually ask the district valuer to advise on that. Because if a scheme was coming in, you'll see policies within here that's actually looking at increasing the density of development, both in terms of making better use of sites for the climate change agenda, but also in terms of getting better housing mixes, which I know has been a particular issue of panel members in the past. So I think that there would be that opportunity to say, well, within our suite of policies, are you meeting all of our policies, including those that would suggest a higher density would be preferable, and therefore you might find that a higher density would lead to more viability on the site.
Do you want to come back, Alan?
I'm happy to leave that point there.
Next question.
There's no point in us dissecting all the different policies. The point is, it's time to get this in front of the people of Leeds to let them have their say. So my next 2 points are on that. The next was a quick one. It's on page 4. I'm looking at it electronically, so it might be different. But on the nice coloured picture, you won't be surprised. I'm not happy that there's no mention of blue infrastructure on there.
I anticipated this, Councillor, and I should have apologised in the presentation. The reason for that is because that's the graphic that we had prepared for the scoping consultation. It will be updated for publication draft, and we will get green and blue infrastructure in there.
I am now happy on that point. Thank you. And my final one is it's quite a meaty tome to consult on, and it's quite heavy going for those of us that are quite immersed in the process and planning and development in general. How are we going to get something, a sort of plain English, simple version of the document that is easy for people to understand and comment on? Because this is one of those things that makes a huge difference to people's lives potentially for decades to come. And it's not necessarily in language and and a form of words that is easy for people to get their heads around the implications of it.
I think it's a really good point, Councillor Green. I'm sure many of you have thought the same in terms of how we present this. And I think obviously welcome comments from members formally as part of DPP, but obviously welcome any informal comments that members have as well on that. We are very aware that there are regulatory requirements of a Regulation 19 consultation, things like the tests of soundness and how these policies meet them, or in some people's views don't meet them, is something that's an important part of this consultation. But what we're really keen to do is ensure that that quite technical legal language doesn't put people off who've got really valid comments to make about this, but might not quite be comfortable with what a test of soundness is. It's our responsibility to, in a plain English way, explain how the tests of soundness work. It's our responsibility, I think, to summarise this material in a plain English way as part of the consultation, and we're keen to do that. And if that's supported by DPP, we'd be happy to take that forward as part of the consultation. Obviously, that wouldn't be ready for an exec board, but it could obviously be agreed by Councillor Hayden and obviously the Chief Planning Officer before we go out to consultation. The only difficulty we have with that is being very clear to people who are being consulted on that's not the plan. So we just need to be very clear about what it is we're seeking consultation comments on, and the status of those summary documents. I think there needs to be helpful guidance to explain what the plan is doing, what it means for you, what it means for your community. If you want more technical information, please go to see the actual reports and the appendices. So I think we're keen to try and give an element of choice to people who are getting involved in this consultation, as we did with the first round of consultation, having summary documents to consult on, but also the main document itself. But we just need to be really careful to ensure that we're making sure people can comment on the right things. But with that caveat, I think we can definitely make sure that this is as approachable as we can make it, which is really important.
Okay, Councillor Lamb.
Yeah, I just wonder if maybe something like a short video might be the way to do it, that you could use all social media channels and then signpost people to the website with perhaps just a brief introductory to each policy and then more detail if you want to. So you're not sort of dumbing down, but you're making it as accessible to people as possible to understand what it is that they're commenting on.
I actually think there's a whole area of work here, not just related to this consultation, but to our consultation style in general. If you think about members of the public who are interested in green space, there's lots of them. If you think about members of the public who are interested in climate change and what we can do to address it, there are lots of them. But those people wouldn't necessarily be drawn to reading these documents or recognise that their issues were embedded in them. And I think there are lots of different ways that we need to work on it for the future, not necessarily for this pack, but we really do need to think. And we have spoken before, haven't we, about involving younger people and children, particularly things like green space, which does need to come at some point. Councillor Carlisle, thank you for your patience.
That's fine, Chair. Thank you. Just thinking about that point, I mean, I was going to bring up the point you made around young people or that, but I was talking at Strategy and Resources Scrutiny Board around the different consultations we do in different departments across the council, and how I think every department is probably learning from how they do consultation, but not necessarily learning from each other, shall I say. And I think having a way to do consultation as the council is probably a way we need to go, and something that people can look at to ensure that all the consultations we do hit the right people. Absolutely, there will be some people that won't consultate, that won't follow a consultation on a local plan because they have no idea that it may contribute to their local park. Yeah. But it's our job to make that relevant to them. Going on, then, I've got a couple of comments and then a couple of questions, really. So I think we discussed this in the workshop, but I was going to bring it up here just to put it more in the public realm. But it's really positive on this, and Councillor Campbell said this is probably something quite radical, and in some ways I think it is, and gives us a tool that we can use. But it's really good in here to have that explicit connection to the carbon budget, the Paris Agreement, and the Climate Change Act, so that it sets, well, to achieve those national targets we must achieve them at a local level. And we really need all areas to follow suit on that, because there is the targets we need to meet are ambitious enough there is no scope for one area or one sector to pick up on what another region or sector hasn't managed to deliver on. So it's really good to have that here to put it into the bigger context and show what we're trying to do. So I think that's really good to see, and that's something that I've made discussions about before and always been hard to connect. How does a particular development or a particular plan fit within what we need to do as a country and the world in that scope? And that's really interesting to have. And it's good to see that. So obviously trees, that policies become more robust and looking at actually replacing the value of the trees rather than a number that might not necessarily match up in the long term. But it's good to see that further protection of things like hedgerows, ponds, wetlands, and other green and blue infrastructure that's equally as important. And I mean, we could go and have every site replace their biodiversity numbers with just planting the same type of tree all across the city, and we wouldn't end up with biodiversity there. We'd end up with a monoculture. So it's really good to see those in. My couple of questions on it really then. So we touched on those different standards, and that was an approach I know we had a conversation around at the workshop, and I agree that reducing that number of standards is really positive. Certainly if something comes that wants to do something innovative and completely different than we've done, something like the situ development or something comes along, then obviously that can come in front of members at panel and they can decide whether what they are proposing to do is equal to what another development would have to do. And that's absolutely fine. And that might work for somebody that wants to follow a passive house standard of some kind, and officers I'm sure will be able to help us judge where that sits in terms of the scale. Just around that home quality mark 4 that we've chosen, I just wonder if somebody can give me the confidence that what we've chosen is one of the higher requirements that would have been there and will get the development we want. Because what we're looking for really in that, somebody like the Climate Innovation District are going to come along with something that is quite radical and quite forward thinking no matter what, but it's the mainstream developers and the large developers that are who we're pushing from behind and making sure that comes out. So that's my first question. And then I'll give you a second one on 20-minute neighbourhoods. I mean, that's right in many. And if you look at that map, you can see where there are 20-minute neighbourhoods in Leeds. And I think what we brought up previously, it's more important to me in a way that we're trying to create 20-minute neighbourhoods in those existing communities where they don't have those facilities than we're just tacking a few more houses on every village that exists and every community that does. So and that point, I mean, very much welcome that point about exceeding the capacity, because there's no point adding houses to a place with a primary school if that's at capacity. And if you try and find a dentist that's currently taking on NHS patients and you found one across the city, then do let me know. And I'm sure there's lots of people that'll be that value that. So really, I just want more of a conversation around that idea of how the policies, and it may be something for local plan update too, but the confidence in what comes, so that those policies are there to create 20-minute neighbourhoods in some of those areas where they aren't. So there are developments like Kirkstall Forge where they're bringing a workplace, a cafe, possibly could be a primary school, and a train station is built. Because of that, they've built their own 20-minute neighbourhood, and that's absolutely fine and builds it. But one of the dots on the map, for instance, is the village of Rodley that we share, Chair, that doesn't have a primary school, doesn't have a corner shop, doesn't have dentists and doctors in it. But the policy should be there to try and create those amenities in a similar way to public transport in here, which is the right way. We are creating communities where public transport can be viable. Are we trying to create communities where this infrastructure will be viable and where people will be able to walk actively, rather than just keep sticking 5 houses on the existing communities that are there?
Thanks, Councillor Carlile. And ironically, the village of Rodley used to have all of those things until people got cars and found that they could drive further on to others. The Quality Mark 4 question was on my list as well. And I'd just like to add to the points that Peter's made. If we settle on Quality Mark 4 as the sort of indicator, how then do we inspire developers or even require developers to think beyond that?
I think it's a good point about home quality mark 4. I think the important point, I think, is that compared to a lot of developments we see in Leeds, I think this will be quite a radical standard. It includes a lot of different elements to it. So obviously it includes the more traditional elements that we already cover in our new policies in terms of energy use intensity and things about whole life cycle carbon, things like that, but it goes into a lot of detail about a whole range of standards, such as bicycle storage, waste storage, and those kind of elements. So I think that kind of quite itemized approach, but it does give some flexibility to developers as well, because it's about creating a score. So you need to meet minimum benchmarks across a range of standards, but you're not forced to meet standards in everything. So there's still a degree of flexibility there. So there's a degree of innovation that individual developers can approach to it. So I think it is a high standard. It's the second highest there is. There's a home quality mark 5, which is I think quite an onerous standard, which I think would be difficult for all development in Leeds to achieve, which is why we pulled back from that to achieve 4. But we still think that is a very ambitious but realistic set of targets. And I do think it still allows for innovation, because it's about meeting at least that standard. There's nothing in the policy that says they can't go beyond that. And I don't think there's anything about home quality mark 4 that necessarily fetters architectural ambition or placemaking in other regards. I think it's encouraging good quality, but I don't think it would necessarily should worry us in terms of fettering that kind of innovation. And you're absolutely right, Councillor Carlin, in terms of if we do receive something that's quite left field, scoring well in some indicators, then it will enable us to, and I think we've got the ability to be able to do some read across of how well that does score across home quality mark 4, and judgments may have to be made at a plans panel about whether the innovation that's been shown for an individual scheme is worth perhaps not meeting some elements of home quality mark 4, but that's obviously a discussion for another day. But I think it would still allow for that innovation, particularly when we're levering on, including the sort of the new P10, which is the policy about design quality and standards. I think when you read those across together, to be able to meet that really high quality standards of design, I think we are hopefully going to see a lot more innovation in Leeds.
Thank you, Chair. Just coming back on the other point you made, Councillor Carlisle, about the 20-minute neighbourhoods, and you're absolutely right to conclude that this really sets a good framework for local plan update too, because when we start to look at housing numbers, new housing, how we distribute that housing, and also how we look at employment and the role it plays within a 20-minute neighbourhood, this policy will really set a really good framework for us to do that. So if we look at the sort of the hexagonal map that was shown on the screen, it's really rich in terms of the amount of information and data that we have within it. And it will enable us to have a much better conversation with local people when we're looking at proposing new allocations. It will also enable us to look at new infrastructure across the city. So something like the mass transit plans, for example, that we have, and looking at the right places and the best places for those mass transit stops to be located, and how they then would fit into and accentuate and improve 20-minute neighbourhoods. I think all of that would be really well served by having this in the local plan update at this stage. So there's definitely a lot more I think that we can do with the 20-minute neighbourhood policy as we then look to other parts of the local plan and the different scope around housing, for example.
Would you like to come back on any of those points, Peter?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think that's useful. And I knew that whole creation of a kind of different way of allocating sites and working out developments was something that will come forward, because I guess my one comment on there is looking at then the capacity of so that point 3C, the capacity of transport, educational health infrastructure as existing or provided as a condition of development. So can I just have confidence that that means say something does come through in the village of Rodley for 15 houses, and we note that they haven't got a bus service that serves that particular area. I mean, it could be any area of the city, add in wherever you want. They haven't got that doctor surgery, that we would be minded to refuse that unless that comes through as a condition. So unless you can provide a frequent enough bus service for that village in order to serve yourself and and the community that's there, then that's something we would be minded to avoid. Obviously, this is for windfall sites only, I will note, rather than the allocated. But
That's correct, Councillor Carlin, and that's the right distinction to make. This is for windfall sites. So when the council's looking at allocating land, it's got more power up front to then talk to infrastructure providers and clarify exactly what elements of that 20-minute neighbourhood are missing and might be needed to accompany any future housing growth.
Thank you, Councillor Brooks.
Already, Chair. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really excited about the 20-minute neighbourhoods. I think one suggestion to build on it would be to include super output areas and the work that's been done on the inclusive growth strategy, to mesh the two things together, because I think it'll be a really helpful thing to compare that data. I suspect that some areas will have better access to facilities, but still have very high levels of need. And I wonder how much of that will be about barriers to access, like financial barriers, or whether it would be time barriers, because you can be time poor as well as cash poor. On the viability concerns, I fully agree with colleagues across the table and on this side. My concern about it is that we will have local update 2. If all of these policies are put in place, how much wiggle room will we have left to increase the amount of affordables, for example? That's a very, very real concern. I'm sure officers have heard me say this before, but yeah, I suppose it's a certain level of priority, isn't it? It's like sort of prioritizing different areas. There was a bit of talk earlier about increasing density. I would have concerns about increased pressure on services. The dentistry point is a really important one. Across the UK, apparently we've got 9 out of 10 dentists refusing NHS patients. And I suppose, like, as a continuation of that, I'd just like to know what actual powers we have as a planning authority to insist upon a specifically NHS dentist to be included in a development, and I suspect that we've got none at all. But that's certainly something that we should be kicking and screaming about, because we should have those powers. We've got constituents who are getting in touch with us, demanding to know why they're not able to get an NHS dentist. So yeah, that's me.
Okay. Thanks, Councillor Brooks. Adam, are you going to start us off?
Yeah, I'll start us off with maybe that Catherine or Martin may want to come in for further detail. I think on the first point, yeah, in terms of levering in things like the super output areas and the inclusive growth strategy, I think Catherine made the point in her presentation about the great thing about 20-minute neighbourhoods concept is that it isn't just a planning tool. It can be used across a whole range of different disciplines. And I think that's how we see this working. It may be that other sections of the council working closely, obviously, with us, can show this in slightly different ways and have super output areas and things like that. So I think that could work really, really well. I think there's lots more we can do with this. I think we're just starting out with it. I think it's almost the tip of the iceberg of what this can do. So I think it's exciting times for this, but we're kind of learning as we go. But I think that's a really good example of something we can add in to make that work for across a range of different sectors. I'm sure there's lots of other layers we could layer in as well. The beauty of sort of digital mapping is that we can do that so much easier than we could have done 10 years ago. So I think it is a really exciting time for that. In terms of the wiggle room for affordable housing in local plan update 2, yeah, I mean, you're right in terms of the prioritisation is obviously an issue. I mean, we can't really comment on that right now because we'll have to assess the viability of that plan at that time, which will obviously be some years away. I think we have to be aware of the general position, which obviously I think you've already reflected on, that the more we ask of development, the more the viability pressures do become pronounced. But at the same time, values increase as well. The amount that developers can sell properties for increases in some areas. So there are benefits through going forward in time as well, because what we'll often hear is that, well, things just get more expensive to build. Well, they do to a degree, although there's some particular price pressures at the moment that we would hope might start to relax over the few years, but also values increase as well. So it's not a one-way process, viability. There are elements to it which also enhance viability. So it may be the case in a number of years that picture looks different from the way it looks at the moment. But it is hard to comment, I think, at this stage, what the viability of future plans may look like. In terms, the question about the pressure on services and the point about dentists, yes, I'm afraid we don't have the power to require NHS dentists to be delivered on site. And it obviously goes well beyond planning some of those issues, but I think it's something that we can see how the 20-minute neighbourhoods work can help identify that. But right now, I think it is difficult to see how it can address those particular kinds of challenges. I know Martin wants to come in there.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think just following on from Adam's point, I think the 20-minute neighbourhood concept works a number of different ways. And one of them would potentially be around critical mass. So actually getting the best out of new development to bring the right number of new residents to an area where we know from our work with NHS partners that actually that then can create a critical mass to deliver new or expanded health infrastructure and other types of infrastructure. I think the point was made earlier, I think it was Councillor Carlisle was saying that we probably need to stop just incrementally expanding places because that's where the pressure comes. I think this gives us a much more better framework to start looking at where actually the right critical mass can be delivered in terms of new housing, and new housing acting as a proper lever of investment to local areas to remedy some of those 20-minute gaps. And that will work with health as well as other things as well.
You want to come back, Councillor Brooks?
Yes, please. So when is local plan update 2 happening?
So the intention is to have a workshop with members in October. And at the end of the formal business of this meeting, I'll be asking members to have a look at their diaries to see when that might happen. And then to bring a formal paper to November development plan panel on the scope of LPU2.
Okay, Councillor Anderson.
It's a problem that's been occurring on plans panels recently. We've pointed out that a lot of the things are, well, minimum standards is what you need to be compliant. And we keep being told by planning officers, well, our policy says, but it's something you said, how do we push it to go further? Now, in the 2 instances I'm talking about, the council were the people who were applying for the planning permission. So if they should be leading in, this is purely in climate change, by the way, it's purely in climate change, that if the council really are serious about 2030, they have got to start leading and showing that their developments and their processes take us further down the line voluntarily, so that we can then say to other people, look, the council can do it, you can do it, because it's a problem that we're coming up against, because we're then told, oh, we'll put it on conditions. And with the greatest respect to enforcement, they are not the greatest at enforcing conditions that are put on planning applications. So how can we build words into this document that say this is the minimum we expect of you, but we, you know, and giving the impression that we're looking for people to volunteer to go further if they, you know, and the council should, in my view, be going further in applications that they're bringing forward. If the universities were coming forward, I'd make exactly the same argument that they're saying that they are, you know, going to be compliant by 2030. Well, if that's the case, how about showing it? Because we've got an aspiration to be zero by 2030, which means there's going to have to be a lot of retrofitting done. So the the more we can get that done in planning applications just now, the better it's going to be for meeting the 2030 target. And I'm concerned that we keep being fobbed off every time. It's not in the policy. There's a review of policy coming up. That's our opportunity to do it. But we've got nothing in here that says this is purely minimum standards.
The example that you give, I'm not on the plans panel forum, presuming that you are, Councillor Anderson, and my understanding of it is that it was a council application which in members' views fell short on climate change issues, and that we ourselves as a council should be showing more initiative. Yeah, I've got the rights. Yeah. So there may well be lessons to be learned from that. And, you know, I would agree with the sentiment that we should be at the top of the list in terms of good practice. However, I think other officers may have been at that meeting.
I'll take that. Sorry, I wasn't at the meeting. I think
not the specific application, Councillor Taylor, the principle.
I'll respond a bit, maybe that others want to come in as well. But I think the point is with this suite of policies that it's not about a minimum that we're just about okay with people meeting. These are really ambitious policies that we should be really keen to ensure that all development meets. And when they meet it, that should be more than enough. Well, not more than enough, it should be enough. You know, this expects development to be zero carbon, expects development to be very high quality in terms of design, placemaking, very high quality in terms of new green space and other GPIs. I think we're setting a really high bar that we should be really expecting to be met. I don't think we should necessarily set it out as here's the minimum, we'd like you to do better. I think we're already setting the better, and that's what we should take as the new minimum, if you like. I think it's in terms of your point about what do we do in the meantime. I think that's more of a challenge in terms of it's up to, it's not necessarily for planners to tell council departments how they want to progress their own planning applications if they are policy compliant. But I think it's important that we reflect on the weight that we can give to these policies. So at this point in time, we can't give them any weight, but we have to be very clear on what national policy says about weight given to policies. So following a round of consultation, we're able to give weight to policies dependent on the level of objection and consistency with national policy. So at that point onwards, we can start to give potentially these policies some weight. But there is a difficult period in the meantime, which we accept. I think, David, you wanted to come in on this point.
Well, it was just to make the point, Chair, that I mean, the policies apply to everybody, don't they? The council as well as the investors out there wanting to invest in Leeds. I mean, as a service, we encourage pre-application discussions with developers externally and internal projects as well. And we want to see all of those proposals meet the policy requirements that we have and which have been adopted. I mean, as with external schemes, council schemes are often subject to time constraints, financial pressures, all sorts of issues in terms of meeting all sorts of different demands and requirements within a compressed timescale. But we are, through the planning service, seeking to deliver the policies that we've worked through with members and we've adopted through an examination process, and we'll continue to do that in terms of the pre-app work and then in considering individual applications.
Yes, come back.
Attended some workshops must have been about 2 years ago, where we invited in certain developers who came in and volunteered that they were going to be building almost zero carbon type properties. And there was one section of the development community who were both not present and didn't necessarily buy into what their colleagues were doing. So their colleagues are confident enough that they've got a business model that enables them to build almost zero carbon properties, but the other not. So it shows you it's possible. And it's how do, but the ones that weren't there do produce policy compliant applications based on our current, and it's how do you get everybody to up their standards, because that, unless we find a mechanism, people will always go for the minimum they possibly can. It's a bit like the comment that Councillor Lamb made earlier on. A particular application might not be viable this way, but by tweaking it slightly, it suddenly becomes viable. And so our job as planning, I would argue, on plans panel, should be to get plans that are to benefit everybody, if we possibly can. That our role should be to do that. And it's just, it frustrates me that we're not willing to go that extra bit further. You know, you can do a bit.
I'm just really to clarify, Councillor Anderson, because the policy that's in front of you is aiming for net zero operational carbon, which goes further than government guidance and goes further than the majority of local authorities in the country have policies for. And it in a sense, what it's doing is it's following that path that was set by the Leeds standard and by the council's own council house building programme for aiming for net zero housing. But that's applying that net zero to all housing development across Leeds, whether it's council or whether
no,
it's
I understand that
volume
part,
house
but
building.
what about zero cost? So in other words, they are, in terms of the current emergency we've got with energy just now, people are, you know, some of these developers who we met can come up with almost zero cost to run your house because of the way it's been built, because of the how do we get people building to that standard within these clients? Yes, it could be zero carbon, not disputing that, but I'm talking about keeping the costs down for people who, and the houses then become affordable as a result of it, because capital costs might be great up front, but the actual affordable cost comes savings.
So the scope of this plan was very much about carbon when members agreed the local plan update. And the policies are very much written around that zero carbon agenda. But the advantage of having, excuse me, a carbon reduction policy, which looks at the energy that building uses and goes further than building regulations to ensure that, just bear with me one tick, just take a drink. To ensure that the fabric of the building is actually better than building regs currently set out, has an added benefit in terms of reducing occupiers' energy costs. Now, so the cost of living crisis, thank you, which has emerged partway through the progression of these policies, is a consideration to the benefits of the policy, because it has a dual outcome. But the policies aren't written specifically around zero cost energy and zero cost energy developments, because that's not where we started from. But if we were to do that, the point that we've heard from the industry and our evidence base is that it's not feasible or possible to achieve everybody in Leeds having a passive house, because simply the materials don't exist, the construction industry simply isn't geared up to it at the moment, and we would find that we wouldn't get that policy through an inspector, because we simply wouldn't be able to demonstrate it was effective for us to build 3,500 passive houses in Leeds each year. But what this does is this allows for the passive house to come forward as part of meeting our policy, but it will also then encourage a change in terms of the green economy and the local green economy in terms of manufacturing different technical solutions for buildings, which are all going to be really important for Leeds to go further along the zero carbon journey.
It was just to supplement Martin's point, is in terms of costs, the energy usage intensity targets that we put into EN1 Part 2 and the space heating standards, I think are quite radical, and they will dramatically reduce heating and energy costs for occupiers of those new dwellings. So I'm quite confident about that. And that's not being done in many authorities. So I think we can take some confidence that we are pushing that agenda in terms of reducing costs down quite significantly. Yes, I'll leave it there.
Does raise some issues actually that we were discussing on site, Adam, where Passive House does a certain number of things to reduce carbon and make them efficient, and then presumably Home Quality Mark IV might do some of those, but a different subset of, or a different set of, and then different ones that you come across do different sets of things. And what I was trying to come to terms with is why aren't we actually doing everything? Well, I think we've got a bit of an explanation there, but I guess the direction of travel is we will gradually draw in more of those techniques, whatever they are, building techniques, electric techniques. I understand Passive House aren't particularly worried about where the water comes from, for example, whereas other types of developers will take more account of that. So it's a question of having the balance across the range of strategies, I think. Councillor Brooks.
Thanks, Chair. Just a quick one, really. It's on a completely different topic. It's about water efficiency on page 33. So it's on the first chunky pack. So it says in this that the natural resources flow analysis found that overall water consumption within Leeds is higher than average. I was just wanting to know how much of that is, like, have we worked out whether that's due to actual consumption or whether it's due to leaks, really?
I'll ask Helen to come in here, but I think it's this is an example of some probably slightly out of date text on that particular reference to the flow analysis, which we may need to just clarify. Helen, I don't know if we could just sort of capture that point in terms of.
Certainly that is a bit out of date now, that fact. So I think we probably need to take it out, just because it was when we had that evidence base back in about 2008. So it's quite old now. And I haven't got a more up-to-date statistic that's comparable. Obviously, we've got other evidence about the drought and the water shortage. So there's still good evidence to support the principle of doing that, better water efficiency. But on that particular point about water consumption in Leeds, at the time, we know it was due to the breweries, the Tetley Brewery, and those processes using a lot of water. And obviously that's not doing that now. So it could be that's not the same anymore.
So it just needs having a look at again. Just a quick review.
We're not going to have an opportunity to do another natural resource flow analysis, which was a very useful thing to do at the time, but that looked at overall consumption of resources across the district. So rather than looking at updating that exercise, we know we've got strong evidence that supports better water consumption and being sensible with the use of water. So we've got evidence about the water shortage that we've currently got. That's a better statistic to use to support the policy.
Okay. Right. I don't think I've got any more in the queue. I'm very sorry, Councillor Hayden. Did I miss you?
Oh, you didn't. I was just waiting for any other comments, really. Just on the point that was raised, and I don't know the particulars of the
the council planning application that came forward, which wasn't very good when it came to carbon. Just want to draw attention to the fact that the council does lead the way, and Newmarket House between mine and Bermontoft and Richmond Hill ward is an excellent example of use of recycled materials. All the paint is recycled that's used for the concrete. And it's probably the greenest, definitely the greenest building that the council owns, if not the greenest in. It's not painted green, by the way. But that we can, and we do lead the way when it comes to carbon, going carbon neutral. My second comment is to just echo your thanks. It's a huge amount of work over the last year or even longer, and really detailed. And it's I'm really proud of the team, and just want to pass on my huge thanks to all the team. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hayden. If there are no more comments or questions, can we just look at the recommendations, please, which are at the bottom of page 9 of the committee report? Are we able to endorse and recommend to Executive Board the proposed publication draft policies supporting paragraphs of the local plan update 1 as set down in Appendix 1 and the sustainability appraisal as set down in Appendix 2? Is everybody in agreement? Yes, I can see nods around the table. And the second one is to recommend to Executive Board that they approve 8 weeks consultation of the proposed publication draft policies and supporting paragraphs as set down in Appendix 1, together with supporting technical information comprising sustainability appraisal at Appendix 2, habitat regulation assessments at Appendix 3, report of consultation at Appendix 4, and duty to cooperate statement at Appendix 5. And note that this will be accompanied by an additional draft supporting consultation documentation, including the council's evidence base and background papers. Are we all happy with that recommendation? Councillor Lamb.
Can we just add the caveat that we discussed, that there would be the addition of accessible options and plain English versions, or something to that effect?
Thank you, yes.
Yeah.
And do you think, Councillor Hayden, that Executive Board will benefit from the non-technical summary, which we could have done with first? Thank you very much then. Is there another one?
There isn't.
There isn't. No.
Sorry.
Because I've missed one. Okay,
Sorry.
that's fine. The only other item of business is the date of next meeting, which everybody has in the papers, and I hope you'll all be able to attend. And can I thank you all for this afternoon's discussion and all your contributions. Thank you for attending. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.